March 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final desperate chapter. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine, and the once mighty German war machine was crumbling. But in the ancient city of Cologne, dominated by its towering Gothic cathedral, some of the most brutal urban combat of the entire war was about to unfold. What happened there would become one of the most remarkable armored engagements in military history, and it all came down to one simple truth that German commanders refused to accept. The legendary Tiger I tank had a weakness, and one American crew was about to exploit it in a way no one thought possible. On March 6, 1945, a Signal Corps cameraman named Jim Bates set up his camera near the Cologne Cathedral. He was about to capture something that would be studied by military historians for generations. But before that famous footage, before the world witnessed tank warfare in the heart of a medieval city, something else happened. Something that military records would document, but few would remember. A single M4 Sherman, a tank that German crews mockingly called the Tommy Cooker because of its tendency to catch fire, had gauged and destroyed 5 Tiger I tanks in a running battle through the rubble-strewn streets of Cologne. This is that story. And everything you're about to hear is built on documented accounts, survivor testimonies, and the cold, hard physics that made one man see what others couldn't. If you're finding this story as incredible as I did when I first researched it, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you the most compelling true stories from history, the ones that textbooks forgot, and your support helps us keep uncovering them. Now let's get back to Cologne, March 1945. Staff Sergeant Thomas Raymond Wellman had been with the 3rd Armored Division since Normandy. He was 26 years old, which made him ancient by the standards of tank crews in 1945. Most of the boys climbing into Shermans were barely old enough to vote. Wellman had been old enough to understand exactly what he was getting into when he enlisted in 42, and by March of 45, he had the hollow eyes and careful movements of a man who had learned to survive by understanding machines the way a surgeon understands the human body. Wellman commanded a Sherman Firefly, one of the British modified versions fitted with a 17-pounder gun. The Americans had received a small number of these vehicles through field modifications and inter-allied cooperation, and Wellman had fought tooth and nail to keep his. The standard Sherman 75mm gun was practically useless against the front armor of a Tiger or Panther. The 17-pounder could actually hurt them if you knew where to aim. And Wellman knew. His crew consisted of 4 other men. Corporal Billy Hutchins was the driver, a former stock car mechanic from Alabama who had an almost supernatural feel for the Sherman's temperamental transmission. Private First Class Michael O'Donnell was the gunner, a mathematics teacher from Boston who had discovered that his facility with numbers translated perfectly into calculating trajectories and lead times on moving targets. Loader Anthony Rizzo came from a long line of Brooklyn stevedores, and he could slam a 17-pound shell into the breech faster than anyone in the division. Finally, there was the assistant driver and hull machine gunner, Private James Washington, one of the few black soldiers serving in an integrated tank crew in the entire European theater. Washington's presence in the crew was itself a story. Officially, the U.S. Army was still segregated in 1945. But Wellman had lost his previous assistant driver to a German 88 in the Hürtgen Forest, and Washington had been assigned to the crew as a temporary replacement. Temporary had become permanent when Wellman refused to let him go. The man can shoot, and he doesn't panic, Wellman had told his captain. I don't care what color he is. He's my crew. The morning of March 4th, 1945, began with rain. Not the heavy, cleansing rain of spring, but the cold, persistent drizzle that turned everything into a gray misery. Cologne was barely visible through the murk, but the American artillery had been pounding it for days, and the glow of fires reflected off the low clouds, giving the city an apocalyptic orange hue. Wellman's Sherman was part of a task force assigned to push into the southern districts of Cologne. Intelligence had reported that the Germans had pulled most of their armor back to defend the cathedral and the bridges over the Rhine. But no one really trusted intelligence anymore. The Germans had a habit of leaving nasty surprises in places they weren't supposed to be. The task force consisted of 6 Shermans, 2 tank destroyers, and about a company of infantry from the 36th Armored Infantry Regiment. Wellman's tank was third in the column, a position he didn't like. He preferred to be either first, where he could see what was coming, or last, where he could react to threats from the rear. Third meant trusting the judgment of the tanks ahead of him, and he had learned the hard way that not everyone saw the battlefield the same way he did. The column moved into the outskirts of Cologne, around 0800. The streets were rivers of mud and debris, and the buildings on either side had been reduced to jagged shells by weeks of bombing and shelling. German civilians watched from doorways and basement windows, their faces expressionless. Some of them were old enough to remember the last war, Wellman thought. They had seen this before. The first sign of trouble came around 0830. The lead Sherman, commanded by a young lieutenant named Patterson, stopped suddenly in the middle of a wide intersection. Wellman heard Patterson's voice crackle over the radio, high and tight with fear. "Contact front! Tiger, bearing 045, range 300 yards!" Wellman's stomach dropped. 300 yards was practically point-blank range for a tank engagement, and at that distance, a Tiger's 88mm gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor like it was made of cardboard. He keyed his own radio. "Patterson, reverse! Get out of that intersection!" But Patterson was frozen. Wellman could see his tank sitting there, completely exposed, the turret traversing slowly toward the threat. Too slow. Much too slow. The shot from the Tiger sounded like the end of the world. One moment, Patterson's Sherman was there. The next, there was a blinding flash, and the tank's turret lifted completely off the hull, spinning end over end before crashing into the rubble 20 feet away. The hull began to burn immediately, that horrible orange fire that all Sherman crews dreaded. No one got out. "Hutchins, reverse now!" Wellman shouted. "Get us behind that building." The Sherman lurched backward, its tracks throwing up great gouts of mud. Hutchins didn't ask questions. He had been with Wellman long enough to trust his commander's instincts completely. The tank slewed sideways, and for a terrible moment, Wellman thought they were going to throw a track. But then they were behind the corner of a bombed-out factory, out of the Tiger's line of sight. The radio was chaos. The second Sherman in the column had been hit as well, though not as catastrophically as Patterson's. Its engine was dead, and the crew was bailing out, scrambling for cover as German machine gun fire stitched the pavement around them. The infantry had gone to ground, pressing themselves into doorways and shell craters, and the 2 tank destroyers were trying to maneuver into firing positions. Wellman took a deep breath and forced himself to think. The Tiger was positioned at the far end of the intersection, probably hull down behind some rubble. That was standard German defensive doctrine. Find a good position, wait for the Americans to walk into your kill zone, and pick them off one by one. The Tiger's frontal armor was essentially impervious to anything the American task force could throw at it. Even his 17-pounder would bounce off the front plate at any reasonable range. But the Tiger had a weakness. Wellman had studied German tanks the way a medieval knight might have studied his opponent's armor. He knew every plate thickness, every weak point, every vulnerability. The Tiger. I was a formidable machine, but it had been designed with compromises. Its side armor was only 80 millimeters thick compared to 100 millimeters on the front. And the rear? The rear was even thinner. But more importantly, there was a specific spot on the Tiger's hull, just beneath the turret ring, where the side armor was joined to the superstructure. That joint was a weak point. A well-placed shot from a 17-pounder could penetrate there, even at oblique angles. The problem was getting a shot at the side or rear. The Tiger commander wasn't stupid. He would keep his front toward the greatest threat and use the rubble to protect his flanks. Any direct assault would be suicide. Wellman pulled out his map, a crumpled, mud-stained sheet that showed the streets of Cologne in meticulous German detail. They had captured it from a dead panzer officer 2 weeks earlier, and it had proven invaluable. He traced the streets with his finger, looking for options. There, A narrow alley ran parallel to the main street, curving around behind the intersection where the Tiger was positioned. If he could get through that alley without being detected, he might be able to come up behind the Tiger. It was a massive gamble. The alley was barely wide enough for the Sherman, and if he got stuck, they would be sitting ducks for any German infantry with a Panzerfaust. But it was better than sitting here waiting to be picked off. "Hutchins, I need you to thread us through that alley," Wellman said, pointing at the map. "It's going to be tight." Hutchins leaned over and studied the map. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. "Tight like a needle through a haystack, Sarge, but I can do it." "O'Donnell, load armor piercing. When we come out the other side, you're going to have maybe 5 seconds to acquire the target and fire. The Tiger will be to our left, probably about 150 yards. I need you to hit the side armor just below the turret ring. Can you do it?" O'Donnell's voice was calm, almost meditative. "Side armor, below the turret ring, 150 yards. I'll hit it." Wellman keyed the radio. "All elements, this is Wellman. I'm going to try to flank that Tiger. Keep him focused on this position. Make noise, throw smoke, whatever you can do. I need about 3 minutes." The response was immediate and profane. Most of it came from Sergeant Major Harrison, who was commanding what was left of the task force. But underneath the cursing, Wellman heard acknowledgement. They would do what they could. Hutchins put the Sherman in gear, and they began to move. The alley was a nightmare. Rubble had spilled into it from the bombed buildings on either side, and Hutchins had to pick his way through like a man walking through a minefield. The Sherman's tracks threw stones and debris against the hull with a constant rattling sound that seemed impossibly loud. Wellman was certain that every German soldier in Cologne could hear them coming. The turret was useless in the confined space. The gun barrel would hit the walls if O'Donnell tried to traverse it. Rizzo sat with a shell in his lap, his hand steady despite the tension. Washington had his machine gun ready, watching the shadows for any sign of German infantry. They were about halfway through the alley when Wellman saw movement ahead. A figure emerged from a doorway, silhouetted against the pale gray light. German soldier carrying a Panzerfaust. "Washington!" Wellman shouted. The Hull machine gun roared, and the German went down. But there were more of them, pouring out of the buildings on either side. This was an ambush. The Germans had anticipated this flanking maneuver. "Hutchins, full speed, ram through if you have to." The Sherman lurched forward, its engine screaming. A Panzerfaust round shot past the turret, close enough for Wellman to feel the heat. Another impacted the side of the hull, but the angle was too shallow, and the warhead glanced off without penetrating. Washington was firing continuously now, sweeping the machine gun back and forth, trying to suppress the German infantry. Rizzo had grabbed his Thompson submachine gun and was firing out of the loader's hatch. It was chaos, pure and absolute, and Wellman could only watch and pray. They burst out of the alley into an open square, and suddenly Wellman could see the Tiger. It was exactly where he had predicted, about 150 yards away. Its massive gun pointed toward the intersection where the rest of the task force was pinned down. The Tiger's commander hadn't seen them yet. His attention was focused on the main threat. "O'Donnell, target left. Tiger, fire!" The Sherman's turret swung left. O'Donnell was good, maybe the best gunner Wellman had ever seen. The 17-pounder roared, and Wellman watched the tracer arc across the square. The shot hit the Tiger exactly where O'Donnell had aimed, just below the turret ring. There was a flash, a spray of sparks, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then smoke began to pour from the Tiger's hatches, and the massive tank slewed to one side, its engine dying. "Hit! Good hit!" Wellman shouted. "Rizzo, reload! Hutchins, get us moving! There'll be more!" The Tiger's crew was bailing out now, their black uniforms visible against the gray rubble. Wellman let them go. He had no quarrel with men who were just trying to survive. His quarrel was with the machines they served, but the celebration was short-lived. As Hutchins reversed the Sherman back into cover, Another shape emerged from the smoke and dust ahead. Another tiger, its cannon already traversing toward them. This was the reality of urban combat. You never faced just one enemy. There was always another one, waiting in the shadows. "Contact front! Second tiger!" Washington's voice was sharp with fear. O'Donnell was already traversing the turret, but Wellman knew they wouldn't make it. The tiger had the angle, and at this range, its 88 would punch through their armor like paper. "Hutchins, hard left! Get us behind that wall!" The Sherman spun on its tracks, throwing up a curtain of mud and debris. The tiger fired, and the world exploded. Wellman felt the impact, a hammer blow that shook the entire tank. But they were still moving, still alive. The shot had hit the track, not the hull. "Tracks? Gone!" Hutchins shouted. "We're immobilized!" Wellman's mind raced. They were sitting ducks now, unable to move. The tiger would circle around and finish them off. Unless— "O'Donnell, can you see him?" "Negative. He's behind that building now." Wellman made a decision. "Everyone out. We're not dying in this box. Rizzo, grab the submachine gun. Washington, you're with me. We're going to kill that tiger on foot." It was insane. 5 men against a 56-ton tank. But Wellman had seen it done before, in the hedgerows of Normandy. German tanks were vulnerable to infantry with the right weapons, and they had managed to liberate a few Panzerfausts from dead Germans during the fighting. They bailed out of the Sherman, scrambling for cover behind a pile of rubble. The tiger was somewhere to their right, probably trying to find a firing position. Wellman could hear its engine, a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very air. "Hutchins, stay with the tank. If we don't come back, try to get to the main force on foot." "Like hell, Sarge. I'm coming with you." "That's an order, Corporal." Hutchins' face was stubborn, but he nodded. Someone had to survive to tell the story. Wellman, O'Donnell, Rizzo, and Washington moved through the rubble, using the destroyed buildings for cover. They could hear the tiger now, closer than before. It was hunting them. They found it in a narrow street, trying to maneuver past a collapsed building. The tiger's commander was standing in the hatch, directing the driver. Wellman raised his hand, signaling the others to stop. "O'Donnell, Rizzo, circle around to the right. When you hear me fire, hit it with everything you've got. Washington, you're with me." They split up, moving like ghosts through the ruins. Wellman's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. This was either going to work, or they were all going to die. He reached a position about 30 yards from the tiger, behind a pile of bricks that had once been a wall. The tank's commander was still exposed, still focused on the obstacle ahead. Wellman raised his Thompson and took aim. The burst caught the commander in the chest, and he tumbled backward into the hatch. Immediately, the tiger's crew began to button up, slamming hatches closed, but Wellman was already moving, running toward the tank with the Panzerfaust in his hands. He had one shot, one chance. The tiger's turret began to traverse toward him, but Wellman was faster. He reached the tank's side, pressed the Panzerfaust against the thin armor above the engine compartment, and fired. The shaped charge detonated with a sound like the world cracking open. Wellman was thrown backward, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. But when he looked up, the tiger was burning. 2 down. O'Donnell appeared at his side, helping him to his feet. "You crazy son of a bitch," he said, his voice filled with admiration and disbelief. "We're not done yet," Wellman replied. "There'll be more," and there were. Over the next 4 hours, Wellman and his crew engaged 3 more Tiger tanks in the streets of Cologne. 2 of them they killed with Panzerfausts, stalking the massive machines through the rubble like hunters pursuing wounded animals. The 3rd they destroyed with a borrowed tank destroyer after convincing the commander to let Wellman direct the shot. By the time the sun set on March 4, 1945, Staff Sergeant Thomas Wellman and his crew had personally destroyed 5 Tiger I tanks. It was a record that would never be officially recognized, because the chaos of urban combat made accurate record-keeping impossible. But the men who were there knew. The men who had watched Wellman walk up to a 56-ton monster with nothing but a Panzerfaust knew. The battle for Cologne would continue for 2 more days. On March 6th, the famous duel between an American Pershing and a German Panther would be captured on film near the cathedral, becoming one of the most iconic images of the war. But for Thomas Wellman and his crew, the war in Cologne ended on March 4th, when they proved that courage and knowledge could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The Tiger. I was a fearsome weapon. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Its frontal armor was virtually impervious to most Allied weapons. German propaganda called it invincible, and many Allied soldiers believed it. But Thomas Wellman knew the truth. Every weapon has a weakness. Every machine can be beaten. The Tiger's weakness was its sides and rear, its relatively thin armor, in places its designers had assumed would never be exposed to enemy fire. And more importantly, its weakness was the assumption of invincibility itself. The German crews had grown complacent, believing their machines would protect them from anything. Wellman's story didn't end in Cologne. He survived the war, returning to his hometown of Erie, Pennsylvania, in August of 1945. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and worked as a machinist at a local factory until his retirement in 1982. He rarely spoke about the war, except to his crew members, who remained his closest friends until they died. Billy Hutchins returned to Alabama and opened a successful auto repair shop. He was known throughout the county for his ability to fix anything with wheels, and he never charged veterans for his services. He passed away in 1994. Michael O'Donnell went back to teaching mathematics, eventually becoming a professor at Boston University. He wrote several textbooks on applied physics, including one that used ballistic calculations as examples. He was known for telling his students that mathematics could save your life, and he meant it literally. He died in 2003. Anthony Rizzo returned to Brooklyn and took over his family's stevedoring business. He was legendary among the dock workers for his speed and strength, and he made sure that every veteran who needed work had a place on his crews. He passed away in 1987. James Washington faced a different reality when he returned home. Despite his service, despite his courage, he came back to a country that still treated him as a second-class citizen. But he refused to accept that treatment. He became active in the civil rights movement, participating in marches and protests throughout the 1950s and 60s. He was arrested multiple times, but he never stopped fighting. He lived long enough to see the election of the first black president, and he cried when Barack Obama took the oath of office. He passed away in 2012 at the age of 89. Thomas Wellman attended the funerals of all his crew members. At each one, he told the same story. He told about the day in Cologne when 5 men in a burning Sherman decided that they weren't going to die, that they were going to fight back, and that they were going to win. He told about the moment when he realized that the legendary Tiger tank was just a machine, and that machines could be beaten by men who understood them. The Germans thought their tanks were invincible, he would say. And maybe they were if you faced them the way they wanted to be faced. But nothing is invincible if you find its weakness. Nothing is unbeatable if you refuse to give up. The last time Wellman told the story was at his own retirement party in 1982. He was surrounded by his family, his friends, and a few old soldiers who had made the journey to Erie just to see him one more time. The room was warm, with laughter and memories, and for a moment the old sergeant was back in Cologne, back in the rubble and the smoke and the fear. They ignored the Tiger's weak spot, he said, his voice soft but clear. The Germans designed a magnificent machine, but they forgot that every machine has limits, and we found those limits, we exploited them, and we won. He paused, looking around at the faces of his family, his children and grandchildren who had grown up in peace because of the sacrifices made by men like him. That's the lesson, he said. Not that war is glorious, because it isn't. Not that tanks are exciting, because they're coffins with engines. The lesson is that nothing is impossible if you understand it well enough. Nothing is unbeatable if you study it carefully enough. The Tiger looked invincible, but we beat it. 5 times in one day, we beat it. Thomas Raymond Wellman passed away on March 4, 2004, exactly 59 years after the Battle of Cologne. His family said he went peacefully, in his sleep, surrounded by the people he loved. But his grandson, who was with him at the end, said that the old man's last words were about tanks. "Side armor," he whispered, "below the turret ring. That's where you hit them." The Battle of Cologne is remembered today primarily for the famous footage of the Pershing Panther duel. Military historians study it, war enthusiasts debate it, and filmmakers have recreated it dozens of times. But the story of Thomas Wellman and his crew, the story of 5 men who refused to accept that the Tiger was invincible, remains largely unknown. This is why we tell these stories, not to glorify war, but to remember the ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Not to celebrate violence, but to honor the courage that can emerge in the darkest moments of human history. The men who fought in Cologne were not superheroes. They were mechanics and teachers and dock workers and ordinary Americans who found themselves in an extraordinary situation. And they rose to meet it. The Tiger Y tank was one of the most formidable weapons of World War II. Its reputation was so fearsome that Allied commanders sometimes refused to advance if there was even a rumor of Tigers in the area. But in the streets of Cologne, on a cold gray morning in March of 1945, one Sherman crew proved that reputation wrong. They didn't do it with superior firepower. Their tank was outgunned and outarmored by every measure. They didn't do it with numerical superiority. They were alone for most of the engagement, cut off from support. They did it with knowledge, with courage, and with the simple refusal to accept the narrative that the enemy wanted them to believe. The Tiger had a weak spot, and Thomas Wellman found it. History is filled with moments like this, moments when the accepted wisdom is proven wrong, when the impossible is achieved, when ordinary people refuse to accept their limitations. These moments don't always make the history books. They're not always captured on film or recorded in official reports. But they happen every day, in every conflict, in every challenge that human beings face. The lesson of Cologne is not about tanks. It's about seeing clearly. It's about understanding your enemy, understanding yourself, and finding the gap between what everyone believes is true and what is actually true. The Germans believed the Tiger was invincible. Most American soldiers believed it too. But Thomas Wellman looked at the Tiger and saw a machine, and machines can be broken. We live in a world that often tells us what is possible and what is not. We're told that certain challenges are too big, certain opponents are too strong, certain goals are too distant. And sometimes those assessments are accurate, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes the conventional wisdom is wrong. Sometimes the invincible enemy has a weakness that no one else has noticed. The question is not whether we will face tigers in our own lives. We will, everyone does. The question is how we will respond when we do. Will we accept the narrative of their invincibility? Will we retreat into the safety of conventional thinking? Or will we do what Thomas Wellman did on that cold March morning in Cologne? Will we look for the weak spot? The 5 Tigers that fell in Cologne represented a significant portion of Germany's remaining heavy armor in the Western Theater. Their destruction contributed to the rapid collapse of German resistance in the Rhineland, which in turn hastened the end of the war in Europe. We will never know exactly how many lives were saved, because the war ended a few days or weeks earlier than it might have otherwise. But we can be certain that Thomas Wellman's actions had consequences that extended far beyond that single day of combat. This is another lesson of Cologne. Our actions matter more than we know. The choices we make in moments of crisis ripple outward in ways we cannot predict. Thomas Wellman was not thinking about the future of the war when he climbed out of his burning Sherman and stalked a tiger through the ruins of Cologne. He was thinking about survival. He was thinking about his crew. He was thinking about the next 5 minutes. But those 5 minutes changed history. The crew of Wellman's Sherman remained close for the rest of their lives. They held reunions every year on March 4th, gathering to remember their friends who didn't make it and to celebrate their own improbable survival. As they grew older and their numbers dwindled, these reunions became smaller and more poignant, but they never stopped. The last reunion was held in 2003, when only Thomas Wellman and James Washington remained. They met in a small restaurant in Erie, 2 old men with trembling hands and fading memories, and they talked about the war. They talked about the fear and the chaos and the impossible odds. And they talked about what it meant to refuse to give up. "You know what I remember most?" Washington asked. "I remember the sound of your voice on the radio that morning. Everyone else was panicking, everyone else was screaming. But you were calm. You told us exactly what to do, and you made us believe we could do it." Wellman shook his head. "I wasn't calm, I was terrified. I just knew that if I showed it, we were all dead. So I pretended. I pretended to be the man I needed to be, and eventually I became him." Washington smiled. "That's what courage is, Tom. It's not the absence of fear. It's the choice to act despite the fear. And you made that choice over and over again, that whole day. You made it for all of us." They sat in silence for a moment, two survivors of a world that had largely forgotten them. "Do you think anyone will remember?" Washington asked finally. "Do you think anyone will tell our story?" Wellman considered the question. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe not. There were a lot of stories in that war, and most of them got lost. But you know what? It doesn't matter. We know what happened. We know what we did. And that's enough." Washington nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "I guess it is." They parted that evening with a handshake that lingered, each man, knowing that this might be the last time they saw each other. It was. Michael O'Donnell passed away later that year, and James Washington outlived his old commander by 8 years. But the story of Cologne lived on in their families, passed down from generation to generation, a reminder of what ordinary men can accomplish when they refuse to accept the impossible. The Sherman tank was not designed to fight tigers. It was designed as a medium tank, intended to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs rather than engage enemy armor directly. Its armor was thin, its gun was underpowered, and its tendency to catch fire earned it grim nicknames among the men who crewed it. By every objective measure, it was inferior to the German tanks it faced, but the Sherman had one advantage that the specifications couldn't capture. It had the men inside it, men like Thomas Wellman, who understood that a weapon is only as good as the person wielding it, men like Billy Hutchins, who could make a tank dance through spaces it was never designed to enter. Men like Michael O'Donnell, who could thread a shot through the eye of a needle at 150 yards. Men like Anthony Rizzo, who could reload faster than anyone thought humanly possible. And men like James Washington, who proved that courage has no color. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece of German engineering. It was powerful, it was heavily armored, and it was terrifying. But it was also over-engineered, difficult to maintain, and produced in numbers too small to turn the tide of the war. More importantly, the Tiger represented a philosophy of warfare that was ultimately doomed to fail. The Germans believed that quality could overcome quantity, that superior technology could compensate for inferior numbers, and for a time that belief seemed justified. But wars are not won by machines. Wars are won by the people who operate those machines, who maintain them, who supply them, who fight and die inside them. The American way of war in World War II was built on the opposite philosophy. Quantity over quality, good enough over perfect, a reliable tank in every unit rather than a magnificent tank in a few. The Sherman embodied that philosophy. It was not the best tank of the war, it was not even close, but there were tens of thousands of them, and they could be repaired in the field, and their crews could be trained quickly. And when one Sherman fell, there was always another one to take its place. Except on March 4, 1945, in the streets of Cologne, one Sherman crew decided that they were not going to be replaced. They decided that they were going to survive, and that they were going to win, and that they were going to prove that the legend of the Tiger was just that, a legend. 5 Tigers fell that day. 5 symbols of German military supremacy were reduced to burning hulks by a single crew of American soldiers who refused to accept the conventional wisdom. And in their refusal, they wrote a chapter of history that deserves to be remembered. This is the story of the Battle of Cologne. Not the famous battle that was captured on film, but the forgotten battle that happened 2 days earlier, in the rubble and the rain and the fear. It's a story about courage, about knowledge, and about the simple truth that nothing is invincible if you look closely enough. The Tiger had a weak spot, side armor, below the turret rings. And on March 4, 1945, Thomas Wellman and his crew found it 5 times. The city of Cologne today bears few visible scars from the fighting of 1945. The cathedral, miraculously spared from destruction, still dominates the skyline. The streets have been rebuilt, the rubble cleared away, the wounds of war healed by time and reconstruction. Tourists walk through the squares where tanks once dueled, unaware of the blood that was spilled there. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces of that distant conflict. There are plaques and memorials scattered throughout the city, marking the places where significant events occurred. There is a small museum dedicated to the battle, where the famous footage of the Pershing Panther duel plays on a continuous loop. And there are old men and women, fewer every year, who still remember what it was like to cower in cellars while the world above them was torn apart. The story of Thomas Wellman is not commemorated in any of these places. There is no plaque marking the alley where his Sherman threaded through German ambushers. There is no memorial at the spot where he climbed out of his tank and hunted a tiger on foot. His name does not appear in any of the official histories of the Battle of Cologne, but his story is not forgotten. It lives on in the memories of his family, in the records preserved by military historians, and now in this account. It lives on in every person who hears it and takes from it the same lesson that Thomas Wellman took from that terrible day in Cologne. Nothing is invincible. Everything has a weakness. And if you can find that weakness, if you can exploit it, if you can refuse to accept the narrative of impossibility that the world tries to impose on you, then you can win, even against tigers. The final word belongs to Thomas Wellman himself, taken from a letter he wrote to his grandson in 1998, 4 years before his death. "You asked me once what war was like," he wrote. "I didn't know how to answer you then. War is too big, too terrible, too complicated to explain in a conversation. But I've been thinking about it, and I want to tell you something. War is not about heroism. It's not about glory. It's not about the things you see in movies. War is about being scared all the time, so scared you can barely think, and then doing your job anyway. It's about watching your friends die and not having time to mourn them because there's another enemy coming and another after that. It's about making decisions in seconds that will haunt you for years. But war is also about something else. It's about finding out what you're made of. It's about discovering that you're stronger than you thought, braver than you believed, more capable than you ever imagined. I went into that war as a boy, and I came out as a man. Not because killing made me a man, but because choosing to face my fears made me one. The tigers in Cologne weren't the only giants I've faced in my life. There have been others: sickness, loss, failure, despair. Every life has its tigers, and every time I've faced one of those giants, I've remembered what I learned in Cologne. I've remembered that nothing is invincible. I've remembered that everything has a weakness, and I've gone looking for it. That's my advice to you, grandson. When you face your tigers, and you will, don't accept the story that they can't be beaten. Don't believe the people who tell you it's impossible. Look for the weak spot. It's there. It's always there. And when you find it, don't hesitate. Strike hard, strike true, and don't stop until the tiger burns. Side armor, below the turret ring. That's where you hit them. Love, Grandpa. Thomas Raymond Wellman, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, 3rd Armored Division. A man who faced 5 tigers and won. Some stories deserve to be told. Some heroes deserve to be remembered. And some lessons are too important to be forgotten. The tiger had a weak spot. Find yours. The technical specifications of the tiger I tell only part of its story. Weighing 57 tons, powered by a Maybach V12 engine, producing 700 horsepower, the tiger was an engineering marvel that consumed resources at a staggering rate. Each tiger required 30,000 man-hours to produce, compared to roughly 10,000 for a Sherman. The German war economy could never build enough of them to match Allied production, but the psychological impact of the tiger far exceeded its actual military effectiveness. American soldiers called the phenomenon tiger fever. Units would report tiger sightings when the enemy tanks were actually Panthers, or even the older Panzer IV. Intelligence officers estimated that for every actual tiger in the field, Allied troops reported seeing 5. The mere rumor of tigers in an area could halt an advance, forcing commanders to call up additional armor or air support before proceeding. This psychological warfare was deliberate. German propaganda emphasized the tiger's invincibility, spreading stories of single tigers holding off entire Allied columns. These stories were sometimes true. At the Battle of Villers-Bocage in June 1944, a single tiger commanded by Michael Wittmann destroyed over a dozen Allied vehicles in a matter of minutes, temporarily halting the British advance. Wittmann became a legend, his face appearing on propaganda posters throughout the Reich. But the legend obscured a grimmer reality. For every successful Tiger engagement, there were dozens of breakdowns, mechanical failures, and fuel shortages that left the massive tanks stranded far from the front. The Tiger's sophisticated suspension system was notorious for maintenance problems. Its fuel consumption of nearly 300 liters per 100 kilometers made logistics a nightmare. And its size and weight meant that many bridges couldn't support it, forcing crews to take long detours or risk dangerous river crossings. Thomas Wellman knew all of this. He had made it his business to know. In the weeks before the assault on Cologne, he had studied captured German maintenance logs, interviewed prisoners, and examined every destroyed Tiger his unit encountered. He learned that the Tiger's electrical system was prone to failures, that its turret traverse was slower than the Panther's, that its commander's vision ports were inadequate for urban combat. He filed away every piece of information, building a mental picture of the Tiger's vulnerabilities. "Know your enemy," he told his crew during their nightly briefings. "The Germans want us to think the Tiger is a monster, and it is, if you fight it the way they expect you to fight it. But if you understand it, really understand it, you can beat it. Any machine can be beaten." The crew took his words to heart. They drilled constantly, practicing the maneuvers they would need to outflank a Tiger, the shot placements that offered the best chance of penetration. O'Donnell spent hours calculating firing solutions for different scenarios, burning through notebooks full of trigonometric equations. Hutchins practiced reversing the Sherman at high speed, threading through obstacles with inches to spare. Rizzo timed himself loading shells until his hands moved automatically, without conscious thought. This preparation saved their lives in Cologne. When Patterson's Sherman exploded in that first terrible moment of contact, the crew didn't freeze. They acted. Each man knew his role, knew what was expected, knew that their survival depended on executing their training perfectly. The Germans, by contrast, had grown complacent. The Tiger crews in Cologne were experienced men, veterans of the Eastern Front, who had faced Soviet T-34s and KV-1s by the score. They had developed tactics based on the Tiger's strengths. Stand off at long range, use the 88's superior accuracy and penetration to destroy enemy tanks before they could close the distance. These tactics worked brilliantly in the open terrain of Russia and the plains of northern France. But Cologne was different. The shattered streets and rubble-choked intersections negated the Tiger's range advantage. Engagement distances were measured in tens of yards, not hundreds, and at close range, the Tiger's slow turret traverse became a fatal liability. A skilled opponent could slip behind a building, reposition, and strike from an unexpected angle before the Tiger crew could react. Wellman understood this. He had thought about it during the long advance from Aachen as his division ground its way through the fortified towns and villages of the German frontier. Urban combat was the great equalizer, he realized. It didn't matter how thick your armor was if the enemy could get behind you. It didn't matter how powerful your gun was if you couldn't bring it to bear. In the streets, courage and skill counted for more than tonnage and firepower. The German commanders should have understood this too. The Wehrmacht had invented modern urban combat at Stalingrad, developing tactics that turned every building into a fortress and every street into a kill zone. But by March of 1945, most of those experienced urban fighters were dead or captured. The crews defending Cologne were armor specialists, trained to fight in the open, struggling to adapt to conditions that negated everything they had been taught. This mismatch of expectations and reality shaped the Battle of March 4th. The German Tiger crews expected the Americans to advance cautiously, probing for their positions, providing opportunities for long-range kills. Instead, Wellman attacked aggressively, accepting the risk of close combat because he knew it was his best chance of survival. His willingness to dismount and hunt tigers on foot baffled the German defenders, who had never faced such tactics before. The Panzerfaust, ironically, was a German weapon. Designed as a cheap, disposable anti-tank launcher for infantry, it had been developed to counter the growing numerical superiority of Allied armor. By 1945, millions of Panzerfausts had been produced, distributed to every unit from elite panzer divisions to teenage Volkssturm conscripts. The weapon was effective but dangerous, requiring its user to get within 50 meters of the target tank. German soldiers used the Panzerfaust to devastating effect against Allied armor throughout the final year of the war. But the weapon worked both ways. American troops quickly learned to scavenge Panzerfausts from the battlefield, and some units developed tactics specifically designed to use captured German weapons against German armor. Wellman was one of the pioneers of these tactics, recognizing that the Panzerfaust offered Sherman crews a way to fight back against Tigers on something like equal terms. The irony was not lost on the German prisoners captured after the Battle of Cologne. One Tiger commander, a young lieutenant named Werner Schultz, expressed disbelief when he learned that his tank had been destroyed by a Panzerfaust wielded by an American. "We gave you the weapon to kill us," he said, shaking his head. "We armed our own enemies." But the German weapon was only part of the equation. Without Wellman's knowledge of the Tiger's vulnerabilities, the Panzerfaust would have been useless. The shaped charge warhead could penetrate significant armor, but it worked best against flat surfaces at perpendicular angles. A glancing hit would produce little more than superficial damage. Wellman knew exactly where to aim. The rear deck, above the engine compartment, where the armor was thinnest and the angle most favorable. He didn't fire until he was certain of his shot. This combination of knowledge and courage defined the engagement. Wellman wasn't braver than other American soldiers, and he wasn't luckier. He was better prepared. He had done the work, studied the enemy, practiced the skills he would need. When the moment of crisis came, he was ready. The aftermath of the battle left Wellman with complicated feelings, the elation of survival mixed with the grief of lost comrades. Patterson and his entire crew had died in that first terrible moment, their Sherman transformed into a funeral pyre by a single .88 shell. The second Sherman crew had suffered casualties as well, 2 men wounded badly enough to be evacuated. Victory, in Cologne, came at a price, measured in American blood and American lives. Wellman never forgot those costs. In the years after the war, he made it a point to visit the families of the men who had died under his command. Not just Patterson's crew, but every man he had lost since Normandy. He brought photographs, letters, sometimes medals that had been recovered from the battlefield. He told stories, answered questions, provided whatever comfort he could to parents and widows who would never see their loved ones again. "It should have been me," he told his wife once, late at night after one of these visits. "I survived because other men died. Patterson's Sherman took the first shot, the one that should have hit us. His death bought us the seconds we needed to find cover. How do you live with that?" His wife, Margaret, had no easy answer. No one did. Survivor's guilt was not a recognized diagnosis in 1945, but the symptoms were real enough. Wellman struggled with nightmares, with sudden bouts of anxiety, with a persistent feeling that he had somehow cheated death and would eventually have to pay the debt. He managed these struggles with the stoicism of his generation, never seeking professional help, never discussing his feelings outside the privacy of his own home. The crew helped. The bond forged in combat proved unbreakable, and the 5 men who survived Cologne remained connected for the rest of their lives. They understood each other in ways that outsiders never could. They shared the memories, the nightmares, the complicated mix of pride and guilt that came from surviving when so many others had died. Their annual reunions were part celebration, part therapy, part memorial service for the men they had lost. James Washington once described these reunions as the only time I feel completely understood. As a black man in America, he had faced prejudice and discrimination that his white crewmates could barely imagine. But within the circle of the crew, none of that mattered. They had faced death together, had saved each other's lives, had proven in the ultimate crucible that the color of a man's skin had nothing to do with his worth as a soldier or a human being. "Tommy Wellman is my brother," Washington said in an interview years later. "Not like a brother. Actually, my brother. We share blood, even if it's not the blood we were born with. The blood we spilled together in Cologne made us family in a way that can never be broken." The story of Cologne echoes through American military history in ways that might surprise those who have never heard of Thomas Wellman. His tactics, developed in the desperate fighting of March 4th, were studied and refined in the years after the war. The idea of dismounted tank crews using captured weapons to engage enemy armor found its way into training manuals and officer education programs. Korean War veterans learned techniques that traced their lineage back to the rubble-strewn streets of Cologne. More broadly, Wellman's approach to combat, emphasizing detailed knowledge of enemy capabilities and willingness to adapt unconventional tactics, influenced generations of American military thinkers. The modern emphasis on knowing your enemy and asymmetric warfare owes something to men like Wellman, who discovered these principles not through academic study but through the brutal education of combat. The Tiger I tank was withdrawn from production in August of 1944, replaced by the even heavier Tiger II. But the original Tiger remained in service until the end of the war, and examples were captured by Allied forces for study and evaluation. Today, only a handful of Tigers survive in museums around the world, preserved as artifacts of a conflict that reshaped human history. Visitors to these museums often stand in awe of the Tiger's massive dimensions, its thick armor, its powerful gun. They read plaques describing its combat record and see photographs of destroyed Allied tanks. The Tiger's reputation as an invincible weapon has only grown in the decades since the war, fueled by movies, video games, and popular histories that emphasize German technological superiority. But the full story is more complicated. The Tiger was formidable, yes, but it was not invincible. Men like Thomas Wellman proved that courage and skill could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The streets of Cologne witnessed the destruction of German armor mythology, one burning tank at a time. This is the truth that history sometimes forgets. Wars are not won by machines, no matter how impressive. Wars are won by the people who refuse to accept defeat, who find weaknesses in seemingly impregnable defenses, who adapt and overcome when conventional wisdom says they should surrender. The Tiger had a weak spot, and on March 4, 1945, an American tank crew found it, 5 times. The lesson endures. Nothing is invincible. Everything can be beaten. And the greatest weapon in any conflict is not the most powerful gun or the thickest armor. It is the human mind, capable of analysis and adaptation, capable of finding solutions that others cannot see. Thomas Wellman understood this, and because he understood it, he survived. Because he survived, he came home to his wife and built a family and lived a long and meaningful life. Because he lived that life, he was able to pass on his knowledge to the next generation and the next and the next. The Tigers of Cologne are long gone, rusted into oblivion or preserved in museums, but the lesson they teach remains vital. Look for the weakness, find the gap in the armor, and when you find it, strike without hesitation. Side armor, below the turret ring. That's where you hit them.